In this video, we're going to take a look at parallel and perpendicular slope. So, before we jump into parallel and perpendicular slope, we need to talk about what is parallel, what is perpendicular. So if we look at these pictures here, we see an example of parallel lines and perpendicular lines. Parallel lines mean that they go in the same direction. They're not going to overlap. So you can think about like sidewalks on the side of a street. They go in the same direction. They don't cross each other. There is a crosswalk, but those aren't the straight lines, right? Or straight lines are parallel, they don't cross. And one thing we want to notice here, notice these little arrows on my lines. Those arrows mean parallel. That's a way that we indicate parallel without writing the word parallel out. So if you see these little arrows and they're not at the edges of a line, like if they were out here, that would just be like, a ray or a line or whatever, okay? If I see arrows in the middle of my line like this, that means that the two lines are parallel. All right, so that's parallel lines. Let's talk about perpendicular lines. So unlike parallel lines, perpendicular lines do cross, but they cross in a special way. It's not just that they cross. It's that they cross, and when they cross, they make 90 degrees. And again, if we want to go back to kind of our street example, when the roads cross, a lot of times they make perpendicular lines. They cross at 90 degrees, especially if you're downtown. You end up crossing at 90 degrees. And this little box right here means 90. So those are our parallel and perpendicular lines just for review. Now, let's talk about parallel slope and perpendicular slope. How do I solve for it? Well, parallel slope actually has the exact same slope as my original line. Let's say I have two slopes, and the first one is, let's say, 1/6. So I've got 1/6. A parallel slope would be going in the exact same way, and this should make sense. If I have one line with a slope, if I want another line not to cross, it needs to be going in the same direction, and that's what slope does. So if my original slope is 1/6, my parallel slope is 1/6. Now let's try perpendicular slope. Let's try a different one. Let's say it's 3/7. Let's say I've got a slope of 3/7 is my original slope. What would be my new slope for a perpendicular line? Now we're going to do two things. We're going to do, well, actually it's called one thing. It's called the negative reciprocal, but it means two things. So reciprocal means we're flipping the fraction. So we're going to take that fraction, we're going to flip it upside down. So instead of 3/7, we're going to say 7/3. And the second thing we see here is negative, or in other words, we're going to switch the sign. It looks like I lost a parenthesis there. We'll put that in right there. So we want a negative reciprocal. So I flip the fraction and I switch the sign. So flip the fraction, switch the sign. All right, so now I'm giving you a bunch of slopes. Let's go ahead and find the parallel and perpendicular slopes. So the parallel slope is always going to be the same, so this is still going to be 1/5. And then my perpendicular slope is going to be, I'm going to flip the fraction, so that's 5/1, and I'm going to switch the sign. So instead of positive, it's going to be negative. So let's see if I can reduce that. Negative 5/1, that's equal to -5, right? All right, let's try this again with slope of -3/2. So I've got -3/2. That's going to stay the same for my parallel slope, right? For my perpendicular slope, I'm going to flip the fraction, 2/3, and then I'm going to switch the sign. Now, this is a common mistake. A common mistake is to say, well, we flip the 3 to a positive and the 2 to a negative, but that keeps the whole fraction still negative. This whole thing, you could think of it having parentheses, this whole thing is actually negative. So instead of being the whole thing negative, the whole thing's going to go positive. So when we switch the sign here, it ends up being a positive 2/3. All right, last one here, we've got 6. That's going to be my parallel slope. How in the world am I supposed to flip 6? Is it going to turn into like a 9 or something? No, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and think about 6 like a fraction. 6 is the same as 6/1, right? So if I were to flip 6/1, I would end up with 1/6. So I flip the fraction, switch the sign, it's going to be negative. All right, so that's how we switch from slope to parallel slope and then also perpendicular slope. One last thing we need to remember is if I'm looking for slope, say they don't just tell me what the slope is. So I'm looking for slope in y is equal to mx plus b. take a look. This m is really important. As long as my equation is set up with y by itself, so if y is by itself on one side, the m is always what my slope is. So let me show you an example. Let's say I have y. Oops, that's a kind of long y. Okay, so y is equal to, we'll do something simple, 4x plus 3. So I can actually basically ignore the plus 3 and the y, and I can zero in and say, well, that 4 right there is my slope. And then I could do my parallel and perpendicular slope. So that's just a review. If you see an equation that looks like this, y by itself, our slope is always this value in front of x. All right, so here's your assignment. I want you to do IXL E.5, and I want you to get to 90. This is a fairly easy IXL. You should be able to knock it out pretty quickly. As always, if you have any questions, shoot me an email. Good luck and happy solving.